Thank you all for coming in today again. Spend a little time with history in the morning. My name is Joe Long, and y'all have made it to the weekly Heroes on Zoom session. Actually, I'm sorry, the semi-weekly, bi-weekly? Whichever one means we do it twice a week. Give me 1 second here. There we go. Mess with our settings a bit. But good morning. Thank you for coming in. And we've got a really interesting topic today. The second in a series of 3 naval topics in our book, Hero Tales. We've been going a chapter at a time through Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge's book, Hero Tales. And in each case, talking about the story itself and maybe why they picked it, what they wanted to teach about what it meant to be an American in the case of each story. And today's story comes from the War of 1812. It is the story of a particular ship and captain and crew, and that ship is the USS Wasp. But a little bit of scene setting is necessary. Scene setting is, I suppose, why I'm always going over my 15 minutes that I assign myself. Thank you for often being patient with that. But a little bit of scene setting is necessary with the naval affairs of the young republic in the first place. We mentioned last week that the new United States had created a navy during the American Revolution, fought effectively, and yet decided once the American Revolution was over that we didn't really need a navy after all. A decision, a budget decision, which came back to bite us as a nation when we found ourselves prey to the Barbary pirates. It turned out that if we were going to trade all over the world, we needed a navy to protect our interests all over the world. And the session before that, we talked about the American consul in France, and how he was put in the position of risking himself in order to save refugees from the mob in the French Revolution. That also played into our early American naval history when we had for a couple of years something called the quasi-war with France. Nobody ever declared war, but when one of the ships from our republic and one of the ships from their revolutionary republic would meet, it would result in a battle. And in these battles, one of the young officers who distinguished himself was Johnston Blakely. And Johnston Blakely is going to be the central guy in this story from American Hero Tales about the cruise of the Sloop of War, Wasp. And here we have a drawing of that ship, the Sloop of War. Now, there are a lot of fine distinctions in the different kinds of sailing ships, and we don't have time for them this morning. But one American habit with our Navy, we did not build at that time, we did not build a large Navy. We built a few ships, but when we built a ship of a particular type, for instance, our frigates, like the USS Constitution, old Ironsides, we built ships of the same type as other nations, but usually more powerful ships. So rather than building the most expensive, the ships of the line, we moved down to the frigate, but made our frigates stronger than other nations' frigates. And so on down the line. Our sloop of war, USS Wasp, is going to be a more effective warship than sloops of the Royal Navy or the French navies. And that plays into our story a little bit as well. Roosevelt and Lodge always use a little poetry to introduce their stories, something I'm very much in favor of. A crash, as when some swollen cloud cracks o'er the tangled trees, with side to side and spar to spar, whose smoking decks are these? I know St. George's blood-red cross, thou mistress of the seas, but what is she whose streaming bars roll out before the breeze? And what that verse is referring to is British domination of the sea. St. George's blood-red cross refers to the British flag, which has ruled the oceans of the world for some time during this time that we're talking about. But now there's a new challenging banner out there, and that is, of course, the banner of the United States, flying from ships like the USS Wasp. Now, Blakely, when he becomes the skipper of the USS Wasp, it's a command he has, it's not his first command. In fact, he has commanded the USS Enterprise, one of the many ships of that name. And then when a brand new warship emerges from the yards for the War of 1812, the Wasp, actually the fifth ship to be named the Wasp in the U.S. Navy, Johnston Blakely is put in command of her. For 150 years, the English ships of war had failed to find fit rivals in those of any other European power. When the unknown navy of the new nation growing up across the Atlantic did what no European navy had ever been able to do, the whole of continental Europe regarded the feat as important out of all proportion. Among the famous ships of the Americans in this war were two named the Wasp. The original Wasp is captured by the British. In memory of her, the Americans gave the same name to one of the new sloops they were building. These sloops were stoutly made, speedy vessels, which in strength and swiftness compared favorably with any ships of their class in any other navy of the day. The new Wasp, like her sister ships, carried 22 guns and a crew of 170 men and was ship-rigged. 20 of her guns were 32-pound carronades, while for bow chasers she had 2 long toms. Now, if you're not familiar with how naval guns were described, or guns on land were described, these guns, the weight of the gun refers to how much a single solid cannonball weighs. And when you talk about a ship's broadside, if she's got 22 guns, 2 of them bow chasers, that leaves 20 that are lined up along the sides. Remember, the ship has 2 sides, so 10 of those guns make up a broadside. It was in the year 1814 the Wasp sailed to prey on the navy and the commerce of Great Britain. Her commander was a gallant South Carolinian named Captain Johnson Blakely. I'm afraid I must admit that our distinguished author, Theodore Roosevelt, stumbles at this point, for sadly, Johnson Blakely was not from West Carolina, but rather from North Carolina. Nevertheless, he was a terrific officer. Her crew were nearly all Native Americans and were an exceptionally fine set of men. The Wasp at once headed boldly for the English Channel to carry the war to the very doors of the enemy. This is a very bold thing to do, but there's already precedent from the American Revolution. At one point, one of John Paul Jones's ships actually captured a small island off the coast of England for a while. And carrying the war to the very door of the enemy is something that only a navy can do. That turns out to be part of Roosevelt's point. The French emperor's ships at that time, England and France being at war as well. There's a blockade along the French coast. A few French privateers still slipped out now and then, and the far bolder and more formidable American privateersmen drove hither and thither across the ocean in their swift schooners and brigantines and harried the English commerce without mercy. Harrying the commerce, what does that mean? Well, these privateering ships in the War of 1812, about which Teddy Roosevelt writes in other books, what they're doing is capturing the ships that carry British goods. And as an empire whose trade goes all over the seas, if the British can't get their stuff where it belongs, if they can't sell their goods in the world's markets, they're in terrible trouble. And it strongly encourages them to quit fighting when their commerce is not safe. So our privateers, by capturing enemy ships, are doing an awful lot to discourage the British from continuing to fight against us in the War of 1812. And it's not just the privateers which do this, but also naval ships. And the USS Wasp becomes what we would call a commerce raider. The Wasp proceeded at once to cruise in the English Channel. Here the water was traversed continually by English fleets and squadrons and single ships of war. It was in this spot, right in the teeth of British naval power, that the Wasp chose for her cruising ground. Hither and thither she sailed through the narrow seas, capturing and destroying the merchantmen, and by the seamanship of her crew and the skill and vigilance of her commander, escaping the pursuit of frigate and of ship of the line. So Wasp is running away from everything bigger than her, meanwhile capturing and causing problems for British merchant ships. Before she'd been long on the ground, one June morning, while in chase of a couple of merchant ships, she spied a sloop of war, the British brig Reindeer, of 18 guns and 120 men. The Reindeer was a weaker ship than the Wasp. Her guns were lighter and her men fewer, but her commander was one of the most gallant men in the splendid British Navy, and he promptly took up the gauge of battle, which the Wasp threw down. So she's going to pick on someone her own size, and in this case, that someone her own size is the British sloop, the Reindeer. And as the ferocious battle is described, the day was calm and nearly still. Only a light wind stirred across the sea. At 1 o'clock, the Wasp's drum beat to quarters. The drumming sounded battle stations to the sailors. That's what beating to quarters means. And the sailors and Marines gathered at their appointed posts. The drum of the Reindeer responded to the challenge, and with sails reduced to fighting trim, her guns run out and every man ready, she came down. The guns leaped and thundered as the grimy gunners hurled them out to fire and back again to load, working like demons. For a few minutes, the cannonade was tremendous, and the men in the tops could hardly see the decks for the wreck of flying splinters. Then the vessels ground together, and through the open ports, the rival gunners hewed, hacked, and thrust at one another, while the black smoke curled up from between the hulls. The English were suffering terribly. Captain Manners himself was wounded, and realizing he was doomed to defeat, unless by some desperate effort he could avert it, he gave the signal to board. Now, this is exactly what the great American captain John Paul Jones had done when the Bonhomme Richard was sinking in a battle with the British. He had grappled to the side of the enemy ship, and he boarded and captured the enemy ship as his own sank. This time, the British are the ones in that position. At the call, the boarders gathered, naked to the waist, black with powder and splattered blood, cutlass and pistol in hand. But the Americans were ready. Their Marines were drawn up on deck, the pikemen stood behind the bulwarks, and the officers watched, cool and alert, every movement of their foe. The British sea dogs tumbled aboard only to perish by shot or steel. The combatants slashed and stabbed with savage fury, and the assailants were driven back. Manners sprang to their head to lead them again himself when a ball fired by one of the sailors in the American tops, up in the sails, that is, crashed through his skull, and he fell sword in hand, with his face to the foe, dying as honorable a death as ever a brave man died in fighting against odds for the flag of his country. As he fell, the American officers passed the word to board. With wild cheers, the fighting sailormen sprang forward, sweeping the wreck of the British force before them. In a minute, the Reindeer was in their possession. All of her officers and nearly 2/3 of the crew were killed or wounded, but they had proved themselves as skillful as they were brave, and 26 of the Americans had been killed or wounded. Now notice in the telling of this story, our authors are not reluctant to give credit and even praise to the British enemy, because hatred or contempt for the enemy is no part of the story they're telling and no part of the values they're trying to pass along. Instead, they're very willing to discuss the bravery and understand the motives of the British sailors and Marines that the Americans are fighting against. But what they want you to learn from the story has to do with the bravery shown by the Americans, and in this case, with some strategy as well. Here we have the Wasp, who's been cruising around capturing merchantmen. And as we said, that is important to shortening the war. Nothing is going to make the British more discouraged than losing their merchant ships to fast and tricky American ships out there. By the way, the Wasp captured several merchant ships in a row and sank them. And of course, the sailors on the merchant ships, they were held as prisoners. And so the next ship that they caught, instead of sinking it, they put all the prisoners on that ship. And then they told them, okay, you guys can leave now, get out of here. Because guarding and keeping safe all of these British merchant, not Royal Navy sailors, prisoners was quite a trouble for a small ship like this. So one of the ships they captured, they just filled it with captured sailors and then sent it on its way. Shortly afterwards, the Wasp would actually see another British ship about her size, the Avon, and that ship was trying to signal two larger ones. So this would be a good time to run away before it turned into 3-on-1, two of them larger than the Wasp. But Blakely didn't see that at all. He saw it as a good opportunity to sneak in and pull off another exploit. And so he actually closed in and attacked and sank the Avon, and then got out again before the larger ships right on the horizon could come to her rescue. And Roosevelt writes about this: it would be hard to find a braver feat, more skillfully performed than this. For Captain Blakely, with hostile foes all around him, had closed with and sunk one antagonist, suffering hardly any loss himself, while two of her friends were coming to her help. Both before and after this, the Wasp cruised hither and thither, making prizes. When it says making prizes, it means capturing ships. Once she came across a convoy of ships bearing arms and munitions to Wellington's army, under the care of a great two-decker. Hovering about, the swift sloop evaded the two-decker's movements and actually cut out and captured one of the transports she was guarding, making her escape unharmed. Then she sailed for the high seas. She made several other prizes, and on October 9th, spoke to a Swedish brig. This was the last that was ever heard of the gallant Wasp. She never again appeared, and no trace of any of those aboard her was ever found. Whether she was wrecked on some desert coast, whether she foundered in some furious gale, or what befell her, none ever knew. All that is certain is that she perished, and that all on board her met death in some one of the myriad forms which must always be faced by those who go down to the sea in ships. And when she sank, there sank one of the most gallant ships of the American Navy, with as brave a captain and crew as ever sailed from any port of the New World. So, the cruise of the Wasp ends with a mystery story. A missing ship, never found, never recovered over the years. A ship which continued to be honored with more ships named USS Wasp in the U.S. Navy, as well as ships which began to be named the Blakely after her captain. But the inclusion of this story in Hero Tales, why does Theodore Roosevelt consider that one to be a particularly good story for us to ponder? Well, one reason for this, he wanted very much to point out not just the bravery of the American crews and captains in going right over under the British Navy and taking on an enemy more powerful than ourselves, but also doing it on their front doorstep very boldly. He wanted to point out the boldness there, but also the excellent strategy of keeping an enemy off balance, of having a Navy which could take American power all around the world when it's necessary, whether fighting against the Barbary pirates last session, or whether challenging at that time the world's real superpower with the British Navy. A Navy allowed you to have an influence anywhere in the world. Now, Roosevelt's writing more than 100 years later in the 1890s, and later on in this book, he will get to different naval inventions, particularly those in the Union and Confederate navies in the 1860s. But some things have not changed. And as a student of strategy, Roosevelt and Lodge, they're both students of world strategy, and they both want to have the choice, the possibility for the United States to do what's called power projection. You can have the biggest and most powerful army on North America without much affecting what's going on anywhere else in the world, or even being able to protect your people overseas. It is a Navy, according to Roosevelt's strategic thinking, it's a Navy that allows you to bring the power of the nation out into the world when it needs to be used there. And so this is one of the things that he wants us to observe, wants us to learn from the story of Blakely. And Blakely, by the way, has got a town in Georgia named for him. He's got a historical marker in North Carolina. As I mentioned, he's had a couple of ships in the U.S. Navy. And of course, one of the ways that he was memorialized was with his inclusion here in Hero Tales. Okay, as usual, I have violated my 15-minute rule, or guideline. We'll call that more of a guideline. But thank you for joining me this morning. I may or may not be able to give you an intelligent answer to questions you might have about Blakely or the Wasp, but I've got a few extra sources here to try to answer things from if anybody's got a question today about that ship and her cruise in 1814.